Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today. On behalf of Meaningless, I wanted to welcome you all. If you are online and following social media, please do tag and use this hashtag so that we can, and your contribution can be connected with the broader conversation happening on this social media as well. So for that, use Ubuntu Symposium in English and Spanish, Symposio Ubuntu. So with that, I would like to hand it over to our colleagues today, especially to Pranita, to start with. Over to you, Pranita.
Thank you, Lakshman. And good evening, good afternoon, good morning. Hope all of you, your family and friends are safe and doing well. This is really hard, difficult time, and I wish everybody is safe and sound. And I'm sure we all will come out of this crisis stronger and better human. So with that hope, I'm Pranita from International Center for Research on Women. I'm your host and moderator of this 2-hour session on men and masculinities, gender transformative approaches from across the globe. The moment we think about gender transformative approach, it has really found its reference more often than not. Many programs talk about it, have used this approach, especially programs which has very closely worked on changing and challenging gender norms. But we don't really often get enough time to discuss what it means. Is it a really common understanding that we all have, especially when we talk about men and masculinities, gender transformative approaches? Where is the focus? Is the focus on individuals or on the systems and structures, or is there some sort of combination that exists, and that's what we focus on? What about other identities? So gender is crucial, but then there are also other axes of identities that really make people vulnerable or some people more powerful. So the whole issue about the need to bring the lens of intersectionality. So with some of these questions, I invite both the teams, ICRW and Concern Worldwide. I strongly believe that it's going to be extremely fantastic presentation. Through case studies, our ICRW team will showcase the interplay of underlying masculinities, couple dynamics, and sexual behavior, and how these shape couples' family planning choices and decisions, and what it means for future research and programming. That's where the focus will be. Concern Worldwide team will be presenting insights and learnings from a graduation program in Malawi with focus on gender transformative approach and how it's changing lives of women and girls. Without taking much further time, let me introduce to the ICRW team. So the way today's 2-hour session is structured, we will have presentation from the ICRW team, and then followed by Concern Worldwide. And each team will have almost 40-45 minutes for the presentation, so that we have almost half an hour towards the end for discussion, for inviting comments and questions from audience. And to make it more interactive and interesting, I really request all the participants, all the audience here, to put their questions and comments in the chat box while teams are presenting it. So let me quickly introduce you with ICRW team. We have Sharmishta Nanda with us. Sharmishta is Senior Technical Specialist, and she works primarily on adolescent and youth development with a focus on sexual and reproductive health and rights. Another speaker is Kuika Seth. She works on public health projects, particularly related to family planning and sexual and reproductive health. We also have with us Aishwarya Sahai. Her work focuses on family planning, masculinity, sexual and reproductive health. Without taking any more time, over to you, Sharmishta, to begin this session.
Thank you, Pranita, and I welcome everyone on the session today. Like Pranita briefly introduced, the ICRW presentation will be about a project where we looked at gender transformative approaches to engage young men in family planning. So I'll be doing the introductory part, and then my colleagues would be taking it forward. So I would like to begin a little bit with why such a project and what was the overarching thought behind the project and how did we go about it. So I'm sure this audience is not a stranger to the dominant discourse on family planning, which is largely focused on women and more so in countries where we have rigid gender norms, and the policies and the implementation mechanisms also reflect the social norms in terms of how the burden of reproduction and hence family planning is lopsided towards women largely. So the idea of this project and the work that we did over 2 years evolved from this core understanding that there is an increasing recognition in countries as well as in the development discourse on shifting the burden a little bit and balancing the burden a little bit. And also, there has been increased interest of investments, of governments to engage men more proactively. But there is at the same time very little evidence on how to do it effectively. How do we engage men in a fundamental concern that has been traditionally and conventionally taught to them as being women's burden? So this was the overarching idea, and with this, we went through roughly 4 phases of our work. Where in the first phase, we started with a global evidence review to look at what exists and what are the gaps in terms of approaches to engage men. And we looked at literature on sexual and reproductive health, family planning, but also some other thematic areas that could offer important learnings. All the publications from this phase are available on our website. We will be sharing the link in the chat box as well. In the second phase, after we had drawn some key learnings, we went on a rapid ethnography sprint to 2 sites in India, which is in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. And we further consolidated our learnings and assumptions on some of the barriers as well as the opportunities to engage men. And in the third stage, we used our learnings to come up with a framework for engaging men. And we also analyzed our data to come up with certain couple profiles. So in India, a lot of family planning work is still very constrained within the institution of marriage. And there isn't enough time to get into that here, but we'll be happy to take any questions or thoughts on that later. So here, when I say couple, we do mean married couples largely. And the meat of our presentation today is going to be around these couple profiles and what did we find within these different profiles that could help us in gender transformative programming. So after doing the couple profiles, we also came up with a theory of change and intervention directions on what kind of interventions and specific activities would be most suitable for each type. And in the last phase, we did a rapid validation exercise. Before handing it over, I think it is also important to situate where we are coming from. in terms of our larger approach to looking at the data and analyzing what we got. So we are situating this largely within an ecosystem framework where we say that the couples, as well as the man and the woman as individuals, are located within a larger structural and normative context, which includes various layers. And this starts with the larger social norms, which also includes the do's and don'ts of how to be a man and how to be a woman. Within that is our health system, which is important in the context of family planning work to consider. And the health system is engaging with communities and families and individuals. So as we looked at our evidence and the data, we understood how these various layers interact within each other, and then ultimately how do they influence the couple as well as the man and the woman, who are our primary unit of analysis here. So I'll stop here and I'll invite my colleague Kuhika to take over.
Thank you, Sharmishta. Let's move on to the couple case studies. Could you please project the screen? Thank you. So before we delve deep into what the couple types were, what the case studies were, I'll just tell you an overarching schematic on how we arrived at this. So we, as Sharmishta explained previously, we did an in-depth immersion, ethnographic sprint, so to say, in 6 sites of UP and Bihar, out of which 4 were rural and 2 were urban. We had 3 engagements with men and women, which were individual engagements and collective engagements to understand their spousal communication and decision-making dynamic. There were also a lot of participatory activities in these conversations, as well as in-depth interviews that were conducted individually with both the man and the woman. So these 3 case studies are around functional. We have classified them as functional couples, mutual couples, and discordant toners. I'll begin with functional couples, and in this trajectory, we'll try and acquaint the audience with where the couple belonged from, what their intimate dynamic was, what were their aspirations, what were their sexual behavior preferences, and finally, what were the family planning choices. To situate the couple, I'll begin with these were some overarching characteristics that we saw in when we analyzed the data of the entire category of individuals we had interviewed. So this particular kind of couple was in early 20s and lived in an urban slum. They belonged to a joint family and lived with their parents-in-laws as well as the brother-in-law and the sister-in-law. Both the partners were minimally educated. The wife a little lesser than the husband a little lesser than the wife, and they had a 3-year-old daughter in a 4-year-long marriage. Coming on to their marital and intimate space, even though the couple had been married for 4 years, their marriage was particularly marked by emotional insecurity that stemmed out of financial instability in their relationship. The woman's natal household was much more better off than the man's, and there was a foundational lie that was told at the time of marriage, and the standard of living that was portrayed of the man and his family was shown as much more than that of the woman's than it actually was. So once the woman was married, it affected their dynamic, and that lie was the sore point between the lives of both the man and the woman, and it came out in all their narratives and conversations and activities that were conducted with them. Moving on specifically to how the man and so to define his masculinity. So, and we'll also touch upon 4 of these roles that we have conceptualized for men, which is that of a provider and the role of a provider that a man takes upon himself to provide sufficiently for the family, that of a procreator, in which, in order to prove his male sexual prowess and be a virile man, that of a pleasure giver, in order to give pleasure to the woman, and that of a protector in terms of protecting the honor of the wife and the family. So we'll basically delve a little bit into each of these roles. So for this particular man, the fact that the situation of the household was financially unstable and he wasn't able to provide sufficiently, made him feel very insecure that he wasn't up to the mark provider for his family and his wife especially. Even though he could not buy the bigger pleasures of life that his wife wanted, he would try and compensate in the form of buying her a smartphone, even though he himself did not have one. As a procreator and a pleasure giver, he was constantly fearful that the wife may find contentment and satisfaction elsewhere, and he was very stressed and guarded about it. And in return, as a protector, he would also sort of restrict her mobility, restrict her engagement with other people in the community, and all that had a lot of bearing on their interpersonal space. Yeah, there were some spaces where he was found to be negotiating and with his masculinity to himself and how he understands it, and that is something we'll move on to in the next few slides. Coming to their couple dynamic, even though the woman's mobility came out to be very restricted, which is also a marker of context that we are talking about, and in communities where this research was conducted, she was able to voice her opinion within the couple space, and even to an extent get an agreement on it, in spite of the fact that the family was a joint family. There was some negotiating power that the women did have, and a lot of it was also due to the financial instability and the lie the couple had initially formed their bond on. The husband did agree to the choice of having just one child, and that too they had a girl, and in a community where there is heightened son preference. And he had agreed to the wife's demand that till the time they're not financially stable, and there was some clear markers that they spoke of as well, they will not go ahead with the second child. If you look closely at the intimacies and sexual behavior of the couple, given their marital context, the couple did initially struggle to have a sound and stable emotional footing initially. But having lived with each other for 4 years, and the man also understanding the place where the woman was coming from and the community they belonged to, there was some common ground that they had created. Both did have consensual sexual experiences, wherein a woman's no was something that she had space for, and the man did listen to. And this was sort of corroborated by both the man and the woman. Both did speak of decreased sexual activity, especially after the birth of their first child. Because we were looking at family planning and who were these influencers or who were these social network people also whom the man and the woman individually relied on or collectively went to, it was interesting to note that the man who belonged to an urban slum and had a market in the vicinity used to go to his pharmacist friend, and that person was his go-to person for his family planning or contraceptive needs, and any advice that he would unofficially seek from. So, and for the woman, it was largely the man, information which was filtered to reach her. So men were also, in this case, found to be the gatekeepers of information of what reached the woman and how and at what time. Simultaneously, the woman, since she did have some virtual mobility in the form of having a smartphone, she did communicate with her natal household pretty frequently, and her brother's wife was someone whom she sought family planning and information on contraceptives in general. Looking very closely at their individual and collective aspirations, it was interesting to note again that their fertility aspirations were directly aligned with their life aspirations. So for them, it was non-negotiable to have a second child till their financial condition is stable. So for those who are well versed with the language, the woman said that till the time we have a kacha house, which means a temporary, not a brick and mortar house, I will not go ahead with the second child. And only when my husband earns the double amount than he earns now will we have a second child. And so was the husband's view as well. He worked in a cloth shop, but he aimed and aspired to own one day, and he was trying to strive towards that goal. Uh, in terms of their family planning choices, they were clear on not having another child, but they were using a mix of methods, which was a traditional pull-out withdrawal method and condoms. They did not report any unwanted pregnancies, so to say, but the man did explained in detail how the pull-out method works for them and what he does to ensure that his wife is not impregnated, and the wife also showed trust in the husband that he'll be able to manage. Uh, but again, their understanding of the traditional pull-out method and also of the calendar method was found to be a little sketchy. With this, I'll hand over the next part of the case studies to my colleague Ashwarya, who will take you to the next two.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone, and good evening to everyone from different parts of the world. Am I audible and visible? I can't see. If someone could just confirm.
Yes.
Yeah, you are. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. So like Kulika took us through the functional couple, so I'll be taking everyone through the mutual couple who exhibit high degrees of collaboration and, as the name suggests, high degrees of mutuality and concordance in terms of their decision making and life choices. So just to get the context in place in situating the couple, this was a couple, a relatively young couple who had one son. And they had been married very early off in their adolescence, and they have been married for 6 years, and they live on the outskirts of the village, and they own a general store which they run from their home itself, and it is run by the father-in-law, the wife, and the husband, and they live in a joint family setup with the father-in-law. The mother-in-law had passed away due to previous health conditions. And the husband also works as a day migrant in the city. So he has two jobs, which then, if we go on to see the masculinity, that there are extreme pressures to provide for the family, for the husband. Then moving on in terms of their education, they both have up to school education, and a part of the school education the wife also completed after her marriage. So the husband was extremely supportive that even after she got married, since she got married really young, he was supportive in her completing her education up to class 8th. Then moving on in terms of their marital space and the intimate space, they both belong to similar castes and class, and that is how they had an arranged marriage. And although the wife's mobility is restricted, she does work at the general store which they own at their own home. And the relationship is sort of similar to the couple that we just saw, the functional couple. It is sort of characterized by financial hardships and also medical hardships that the woman had experienced during the birth of her first child. Despite these, they are seem to be extremely collaborative, and they support each other in terms of decisions, and each other's comfortability is one of the greatest factors they take into account while making these decisions. And this is something that is then reflective even in terms of how the man expresses or manifests his own masculinities in the intimate space. So, in terms of his role as a provider, he does feel significantly pressurized to provide for his family, along with the financial debts and the medical bills that need to be taken care of. The father-in-law usually doesn't keep well, so his medical expenses are also to be taken care of. In terms of the role of a protector, the man does sort of protect his family and his wife in terms of restricting the mobility. His idea of protection is in terms of restricting the mobility of his wife, and he doesn't even let her step out even for something as simple as taking water from the well or something like that. And he feels that he can provide her everything while she's within the house. So that is something that is there. And in terms of pleasure giver and procreator, uh, usually they have a very strong religious faith and belief, which is why they don't engage in sexual activity as much, and that is something that has been in their relationship from the very beginning, and that then reflects in their overall couple dynamic. Having said all these things regarding his masculinity, it is that they have an exceptionally strong spousal communication where they discuss each and everything, whether it is regarding health, whether it is regarding finances, or family planning, contraception. All these decisions they discuss within themselves, and they are an extremely strong unit within themselves, and they don't usually consult with anybody else. Like the woman and man both kept articulating that we don't need to refer to anyone else or ask anyone else anything. We are self-sufficient and we take our own decisions. And even in case of any differences, whether it is regarding some financial issues or anything, they usually resolve it amicably, and they make it a point to spend time together, sit together, eat together. So those are some of the things that are in everyday practice for them, which sort of builds their strong couple dynamic and various points of collaboration. Um, then in terms of their sexual behavior, so they had their first child very early on in their marriage, when both of them, being young, had a little idea about, a little knowledge about family planning. So and because of that, they had their first child within the first 2 years of marriage. But due to the reproductive issues and the issues that the woman faced at the time of the first delivery, she underwent few surgeries after the delivery. They do not plan on having another child anytime soon. So for that, they abstain from any sexual activity by choice because of this constraint of not wanting more children, because of their religious beliefs and faith, as well as because there are other logistical barriers in the house where the child sleeps with them, or because the father-in-law is present. So because of those issues, they don't engage in sexual activity that often. Uh, Given that the woman's mobility is restricted, the man, however, is extremely enterprising. He is the one who provides all the information to the woman, whether it is regarding family planning, contraception, and he seeks all this information by visiting PHCs and public health centers, and where he visits the doctors and reads through the posters. So that is where he gets a lot of his information from. The woman did, in the initial years of marriage, get some information around traditional methods from her natal home. Her mother and her sister, they told her about the standard days method. But a point that was reiterated by them was that they don't really engage with other people in the village. Even the health system actor or the frontline workers do not visit them often. So their sources of information are limited to what the husband gets for them. Then, in terms of their individual and collective aspirations, so the strongest point of collaboration for this couple is where they. This is where they collaborate the most, because the education of their son is something that they really aspire for. That is a collective aspiration for them, which then also points to a greater aspiration for financial prosperity. So the idea of giving a good education for their son also comes from the fact that they themselves have not had good education, and so they want to provide the best opportunities for their child. And they would even consider moving to the city to provide him that opportunity. Other than that, they want to have better amenities in their home. They wish to travel, and these are some of the things that they collaborate the most on. Then all these are then reflecting in their family planning choices, where in case they already had an infrequent sex and their sexual activity was anyway low, even then when they got married after the first child was born, they used a mix of both traditional and modern methods. but because of some constraint, and because of just not being able to easily use methods such as condoms and also the traditional methods, they were not able to understand the standard day method correctly. They sort of dropped those methods, and the woman finally switched to injectable contraception, which she has been taking for over a year now. And something that they also really wished for, which they kept articulating, was that if ever they choose to have a second child, they would really like to have a daughter. That again is stemming from their religious beliefs, that they see that giving away of a daughter in the Indian marital ceremony is something which is considered as a path to salvation. So for people who understand it, to achieve moksha. So having a daughter is sort of a collective aspiration that they have. But whenever they complete their family size, if they have another child, they would finally go for the woman undergoing a hysterectomy, because the husband was completely against male sterilization and said that it is something unnatural and I would not undergo that or do that to my body. So that was mutual couples. Should we move on to the next?
Yes, Aishwarya has moved it, but I think there is a little bit of a lag. It will show up.
Yeah, okay. I can see it. Okay, thanks. So the last case, the couple typology, is the discordant toners. So we just spoke about the mutuals who showed a high collaboration. At the other end of that spectrum of couple types is the discordant toners, who are sort of living with unresolved conflicts and have not been able to come to a final consensus around those conflicts. And there is a high degree of discordance and even violence in some cases. So to exhibit that, situating this particular couple, so they are a fairly older couple. They have been married for over 15 years and have 3 children. They have completed their family size, and the man works on the land, and during the off season he also drives a car. He's a driver as well. And the woman is uneducated. And that has been an ongoing point of conflict for the couple from the very beginning. Since going into their marital space, they were both married off very young. Uh, the woman started living with the man after she turned 18, because they had, after the Gona, in the Indian context, where the woman comes to the man's house only after she attains puberty. So only after that did they start living together. And it was because primarily of the conditions of the man's house, where he had to marry an uneducated girl because there was a lot of parental pressure. His mother was unwell, and that is why he was pressurized into marrying her. And that has been a sour point in the relationship, which the woman also kept articulating, that she is ashamed about her lack of education, and she is constantly sort of shunned for it by her husband. Then that sort of conflict also reflects in the masculinity that is exhibited by the man, that the man feels responsible for providing for the family, and he takes all decisions around finances, around health, around assets and everything. And he does not really consult anybody else in the family. He also restricts his wife's mobility, and it comes from the belief that the woman should stay at home and just perform her role as a caregiver and nurturing the children, and she should listen to her husband and obeys and does what he says. So it is coming from very strong, rigid masculine beliefs, and that is something that is exhibited throughout their couple dynamic, where the man then has all the power in the relationship. And even though they have some amount of spousal communication, and the wife does try to sort of put her point of view forward, it is not taken into consideration, including decisions around her own reproductive and contraceptive choices. So, what kind of contraception to use, when to have the child, or when to not use a certain method, all these decisions are taken by the man himself. And the woman's role is then just limited to nurturing the child, caretaking, cooking, and he makes sure that that is the space where the woman operates alone. Then, in terms of their sexual behavior, so they both reported that ever since their family size was completed, the sexual intimacy or the sexual intercourse, the frequency has decreased. And even then, they tend to have it around once a week or twice or thrice a week. And the woman feels the woman sort of feels takes sexual activity as a duty, and she sort of resigns to her husband's advances, because even though she enjoys it, she doesn't really, because of so many instances of forced sex where she has said no and the man has not listened to her and forced himself despite her disapproval. She just takes sexual activity as a mere duty now. And that is why there have also been instances of violence. So now any sort of resentment or any sort of no to sexual activity has a fear of being met with violence, which is why now she has just resigned to her duty of performing sexual activity with her husband as a wife. And the husband keeps his own sexual needs over the comfort of his wife. Then, in terms of the access to information, which again stems from the rigid masculinity, where the husband keeps is both the provider of all the information and also the gatekeeper. He is the one. He is a very again a very socially enterprising man who goes out, takes information, talks to the health system actors, reads up on the internet, and takes all this information. But the wife's only source of information happens to be what she receives from her husband. And even in that, like even if she does happen to have some interaction with some female peers in the village, they in turn get information from their husbands. So it overall boils down to her being dependent on her husband for information, and he himself is extremely enterprising in that aspect. He says that no, women should timely space their children, they are not baby making machines. Yet when we look at the sexual behavior, the reality in their own intimate space is something else. Then, in terms of their collective and individual aspirations, so given that the large family size that the couple have, the woman remains extremely financially insecure about their position and about how they would raise three children, with the man being the only bread earner in the house. And she also tends to borrow money from her natal home from her father. The husband, on the other hand, is experimental. He wants a good social standing. He wishes to set up his own business. He wants to be known. And he thinks that his wife is not supporting him in this pursuit of wanting a better social standing and experimenting with his professional choices. And this lack of education of the wife also makes him feel that he has to bear the burden, and there is no sort of alignment in how they aspire their future. And the financial crisis and the financial instability that they seldom go through, that is a major point of conflict in their relationship. Then lastly,
Aishwarya,
yeah,
maybe just 10 more minutes to complete the whole presentation.
I'll just hurry up with this one. This is the last one. Yeah. So just in terms of their family planning choices, they've completed their family size, and the woman has undergone female sterilizations. But other than that, throughout her journey of contraception, they have sort of switched between various methods, between condoms, pills, but there have been multiple failures of these methods, including one miscarriage, two abortions, and the last two children who were unplanned pregnancies. So, despite all the physical implications that she has had because of this reproductive journey, the woman is the one who underwent female sterilization, because the man again was against male sterilization. That's it. Thank you. I would hand it over back to Kuhika for the analysis. Thank you.
Thanks, Aishwarya. While the screen is changing, I'll just want to say a few things. That these three case studies are just directional and examples of how the three couple types are. Of course, they are not so specific. And once the entire analysis of the data was done is when these came to be. Shamisha, can I have the screen, please? I can't see it. So while we saw very specific details of the three couple types, and they are varied, and they also have points of convergences as well as divergences. Just to bring a much more nuanced approach to programming, we would want to posit a matrix of analysis sort of a thing, in which we can see an overview of and bring a gender lens in, so as to understand, as one program will not work with one couple type, but will always have a large respondent or beneficiary base to cover. How can they then keep in mind to sort of reach maximum people by understanding their couple dynamic and by understanding their intimacies a little. I still think the screen is stuck, but let me see what I can do.
I think the screen is stuck, Kuhika. Why don't you begin and we'll try to fix it?
Just let me know if it comes. I'm projecting my screen.
Okay.
Yes, it is here.
Yeah, it's clear.
Great.
Please go ahead.
Just give me a moment, guys. Sorry for that. So just to give you an overarching, as we were discussing, so we'll just touch upon a few domains. We are also running out of time. We have another team presenting. So to look at the characteristics of mutuals, who we call mutuals. So they display mutuality on most of the key domains in their lives. For instance, the timing of sex or the first child, the subsequent births, as well as their aspirations. They are interested in each other's growth. Partner concern in mutuals is typically high. The health and well-being of the woman is also something that the man considers, and vice versa. Emotional intimacy was also found to be something that was very high in mutuals. When we look at functionals, they may have mutuality on some domains, but they may lack mutuality on some others. And when I say some of those domains can be around health of the child, or education of the child, or what do they want their child to become once he or she grows up, is something that they still come together on. But when it comes to other domains like having sex, or when to have sex, and what contraceptive to use, they may not still look eye to eye in those cases. Why they are different from mutuals is also their relationship is marked by some overarching conflict that dictates their life, and that conflict is something that they are unable to resolve. They do display some ability to negotiate and work around their relationship, and hence their functionality as a couple in that sense does not suffer. When we come to discordant donors, on the other hand, they have discord on most of the domains in their life, from expenses to sex to children to when to have sex. Partner concern is largely non-existent. Absence of aspirations or differential aspirations. Their relationship may also be marked by lack of emotional intimacy. If we look at the spousal communication and decision-making style of these couples, mutuals are highly communicative around most domains. The communication may be in active verbal communication, or even as gestures. Even that is pretty heightened in mutuals. Those domains may be around children, their own desires, sexual activity, reproductive health of the woman. The decision making that they undertake is largely joint, and they do so in a very collaborative manner. When we come to functionals, their communication may be present in few domains and may be completely absent in others. The few domains in which it's present is daily expenses, elderly care, child care. But when it comes to intimacies, it is most likely that it's going to be absent. Voice of the husband is definitely higher in functionals, and the woman's opinion may largely be considered only in the routine functionings of the household. In discordant donors, there is minimal degree of communication, so much so that it can also be called disrespectful communication in many cases. Decision-making process in our context, we saw that it was mostly and largely led by the man, and the women usually resign to the decisions taken by the man, or else take covert decisions. Physical bodily harm and other forms of violence in the garb of intimacy was always prominent in discordant donors. The kind of masculinities that the men in these three couple types display are also a little varied, and that impacts the family planning behavior. The pressures to provide are heightened in all of these three, but in mutuals, the man discusses it with the partner and may also seek help from the partner or support from the partner in some way. Mutual pleasure for sexual activity and even otherwise is taken into account. Procreation is looked at as a collaborative act rather than something that is done to prove the masculine prowess of the man. Role of procreator is not so heightened in the role of protector is not so heightened in the man. There is more mobility for the woman, and the choices of the woman and the voice of the woman is also more equal in mutual, so to say. If we come to functionals, then the mutual pleasure is not taken into account. Women look at sex as a duty and men look at it as a performative act. Procreator role, the man does look at it as his job to produce a child or a male here to the family. Protector role is again heightened in the form of controlled mobility and access. And when we look, coming lastly to the discordant donors, these relationships, in these kind of relationships, the role of the provider is heightened and a lot of times also dismissed by the man. No interest in providing sufficiently for the family, maintaining a status quo in which the needs of the family are not being met. Presence of coercive and forced sex, both is there. Procreator, the man does look at it as his job. Protector role is again very high. No presence of a smartphone, no outside influences, no access points for the woman. These relationships, in terms of pregnancies, are also marked by multiple abortions. Method use may be erratic or completely absent. So this was just to sort of give a overview of what we all just discussed in those three very specific case studies, and these are then may help in forming an approach for a gender transformative programming, which we all look at and we all programs aspire to get those in their programs. I'll end with that, moving on to Sharmishta, who will conclude the presentation and wrap this up. Thank you.
I'm sorry about the snag. There was some issue on my screen. So just to wrap up, everyone can see the slide that Aishwarya has put up, I hope. So yes. We have, after all of our analysis and looking at the evidence, we came up with a set of principles within which we thought we would like to proceed further in terms of designing interventions as well as providing some broad recommendations for programmers as well as researchers for further work. So on the right side of the slide, you could see some of the principles that we took out from our work, which is that in order for programming to be gender transformative and to be amenable to better and more effective male engagement, it needs to be adaptable. It needs to follow certain core principles of gender equitable work in development. And it has to be user-centric, meaning the gist and the value of the work that we are proposing has to come from the people for whom we want to design interventions. And it has to be couple empowering. And by that, we mean that we don't look at approaches or interventions that are only resourced and thought for in terms of empowering women over men or empowering men over women. But we look at approaches that can create that common space for sharing and growing in terms of breaking down and understanding their own gendered barriers.
And because there is a paucity of time, I'm not going into the specific recommendations, but we'll be happy to come back to some of this if we have time during the discussion. So I'll pause here, Pranita. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarmishta. Thanks for all the presentation that you all have made. It's quite interesting. Now, without taking any much time, I'm just introducing colleagues from Concern Worldwide. We have 3 speakers here, and I'll request Adil to move the slides while I introduce. So we have Thokojani Kalanze, who is a graduation program manager from Concern Worldwide Malawi. We have Adil Fox, equality advisor, Concern Worldwide. And the third speaker is Tara Bedi, PhD fellow, Department of Economics, Trinity College Dublin. So thank you all 3 of you, and over to you, Thoko, to initiate the presentation.
Thank you very much. Just as she said, my name is Thokozani Kalanje, or Toko in short. I work with Concern Malawi as a graduation program manager. So for today, we'll be talking through a presentation on gender transformative programming, changing women's lives. Next slide, please. For the session overview, we'll talk through the following. First, we'll talk through why gender transformative programming in Malawi, and then we'll talk through our approach, that is the preparation, the program design, and also the research component. We'll also talk through what seems to be working here in Malawi, the gaps that we've seen, and where we go from here. And then finally, we'll have a discussion on any possible questions or comments on our presentation or anything related to our presentation. For the context in Malawi, Concern conducted a formative research before the start of the program, which was done in 3 districts, which are in the southern part of Malawi, and this was done in 2017. So in terms of findings that were there at the time, the first one was that men suffer intense condemnation, and this is mostly when they fail to play their role as a provider. Secondly, we also found that men are said to be bewitched or laughed at by other community members. That is, if they assist their wives with chores in the household, because household chores are generally believed to be for the women, according to our rural areas. The third thing that we found was that men should provide some kind of income for the household, and then this also helps them to control decision making. We also found that men must provide to maintain the upper hand in the household, which is related to the point above, where they like to maintain control in the household. And also, polygamy is used as a threat, where the husband would tell his wife that if you don't do what I want, then I'll get another wife. So that is what is used as a threat to make sure that the wife does what the husband wants. Sex is also perceived as transactional, where if a woman earns more money, it is emasculating. And if a woman is seen as being independent, then she is presumed to be using sex in order to earn an income. And also the burden of providing falls solely with the man. But then, even though this is the case, he can abandon his family and leave if he feels that the pressure is too much. Whereas on the other hand, a woman cannot abandon her family and leave because she feels that she's responsible for her kids and whoever it is that she's staying with, even though she's not the sole provider of the household. So there were 4 main recommendations which came from this formative research, and this helped us to design our program. The first one was that we need to address toxic masculinities and provide support to men who embody alternative masculinities. We also need to recognize the gendered impacts of localized beliefs and also the contextual differences. That is, even though the program is being implemented in Malawi, but then the context was different from district to district. The third recommendation was that program staff and trainers must engage with their own gendered assumptions, norms, stereotypes, and identities before they begin to bring such interventions to communities. The fourth recommendation was that we need to bring both to the broader community that they can also be members. The fifth component was asset transfer. But for Malawi, what we opted to do was actually capital transfer. So after they completed their business skills training, which was done for a period of about 4 months, and we supported them to come up with business plans and to identify the right type of IGA, then we provided a capital transfer, which they used to either start a new IGA or to boost an already existing IGA. The program is for 5 years. We started in 2017 and we shall finish end of this year in December 2021. In terms of who we target, we aim to target the extreme poor and poor households who have labor capacity. But then because of the gender transformative component, we targeted households who are married. So in total, we had 2,000 households who were part of the graduation package. And then we had 6,000 households who were part of the enabling environment package. So what makes this program unique? So the program has the gender component, which is known as Umodzi. Umodzi is a Chichewa word which means united. The program engages couples to discuss issues such as gender norms. They discuss power, issues of decision making, budgeting, violence, positive parenting, and also healthy relationships. So these are all topics which are discussed as part of the gender transformative training or Umodzi. So these topics are offered to the households. One topic is offered in a month, and they go through this training for 12 months. And then the training is attended by both the husband and the wife. But then of the 12 modules, we have 3 modules which the men and the women, they attend the modules separately. So the aim of this training is to transform gender and power relations among the targeted couples. In terms of theory of change, Umodzi aimed to increase the following. First was cooperation. That is to make sure that couples make more decisions together and create a common vision of what they want for their family. We also wanted to increase budgeting and planning skills of the household. That is to increase efficient resource allocation, thereby increasing the productivity of the household, strengthen behaviors around savings and also investment change, and also on resources which are spent on children. We also aimed to improve the couple's communication skills. That is to enable them to manage stress and anger in better ways, because usually there will be violence where the husband will beat his wife if he feels like he's angry or she's done something to disrespect him. And then we also wanted to improve the women's income generating options by changing attitudes around acceptable occupations and also around mobility. We also aimed to decrease conflict and violence triggered by shifts in power due to the female spouse being the graduation program recipient. That is for these Umodzi households. It was the woman who was the primary recipient. That is to say that the cash and the trainings went through her. So in order to deal with this shift in power, we also aimed to decrease the conflict and violence which is triggered by this. We also aimed to decrease conflict between children and parents through providing new ways to parent, because we are strong believers in spare the rod, spare the child. So wanted to give them better ways to parent as opposed to beating their children. So I'll now hand over to Adele, who will talk us through the Sonke gender justice slides. Thank you.
Thanks, Toko. So Concern is in a global partnership with Sonke Gender Justice, and they have made a large contribution to this program and lots of our other programs. So kind of on their behalf, I'm just going to talk you through what that looks like. So just a quick introduction to Sonke, who many of you may already know. They are a South African-based NGO, and they're really committed to promoting gender equality, preventing domestic and sexual violence, and reducing the spread and the impact of HIV and AIDS. Their beliefs are fundamentally around gender equality and women's empowerment, and that greater equality is going to benefit everybody. And that this is more achievable if we work together, and that men are a key part of the solution. So engaging men and boys is really one of their key strategies, and it's something they've got lots of extensive experience on all over the world. And by that kind of approach, they're creating spaces where men and boys can really discuss and confront and reflect on some of those patriarchal notions of what it means to be a man, and those kind of masculinities that are often actually at the very root of gender inequalities. So Concern's been in a partnership with them since 2017, and the aim of this partnership was to strengthen Concern's capacity to do gender transformative programming. So we had some experience of doing this before for the last kind of decade, but we knew it was a promising approach, and we wanted that extra technical support to help us build our capacity in that area and have a stronger and more consistent approach. So we brought Sonke on board, and that's an ongoing partnership at the moment. So what this looks like in practice is that Sonke visit our country programs. So they visited Malawi, the first time was back in 2018. And they hold workshops for our staff and our partner staff, where they can really reflect on their own personal attitudes and beliefs, values, behaviours. It's a very personal workshop. It's very interactive and experiential. And it talks about the same kind of things that Toko mentioned are in the Umodzi curriculum. So it's about gender norms, power dynamics, violence, healthy relationships, and then more about what actions people can take to change things in their homes and their communities. So we start off with that. And this photo here is one of the activities that we do. It's called the Gender Fishbowl. So you've got the women in the centre of the room, and the men sitting around the outside. And we pose a number of questions to the women in the middle of the room about what it's like to be a woman and their experiences of different things and what they would like men to know. And the men have to sit there in silence, just listening. And then we switch them over and we ask men the similar kinds of questions. So this is an activity that's really around generating empathy between men and women and giving them that space they may not have had before. So once we've done that stage, the next stage is to prepare staff to facilitate something like Umodzi or a similar kind of process that they've been through at community level. So this can be like a training of trainers approach, which is how it was in Malawi, because the staff who facilitate Umodzi were not on board at the time of the first visit. So Sonke trained some staff that were there, who then trained those new staff once they were recruited. And then Sonke were able to go back and do a kind of refresher with those staff who were facilitating at community level, and do a refresher on their facilitation skills as well. And then last year, because of COVID and Sonke couldn't travel, they carried out some remote support sessions to the staff who facilitate at community level, just to kind of talk through the challenges they might have experienced, and just their experiences of how the whole thing was, and that because they are there managing some potentially quite difficult conversations. So that was the kind of remote support they also provided. So this is a quote from one of our Concern staff who went through the Sonke training, who said, the Sonke training was eye-opening in so many ways. After the training, I noticed changes in how male and female staff interacted when we realised different assumptions that we've been making about our colleagues. Even in my own home, as a husband and a father, I started conversations with my children and my wife about gender equality and negative norms. The training helped me in facilitating sessions with communities as I could speak about my own assumptions and the changes that occurred to me personally. So I think this kind of just shows the importance of doing this phase whereby the people that we expect to facilitate something like Umodzi have had the chance to reflect on themselves first, especially since many of them will come from the same communities in which they're working. So they're probably going to have grown up with the same sorts of attitudes and beliefs. And also it kind of, it's multi-pronged. We're talking about changing attitudes towards the workplace, but then ultimately towards kind of role modeling that kind of behavior that we want to see at community level with our own staff. So I think this quote kind of really sums up the power of this approach in ensuring that our programs have that kind of quality, especially when we're dealing with such a sensitive topic. So with that, I will hand back to Tara.
Thanks, Adele. Good afternoon, everyone, from a very sunny Dublin. My name is Tara Beatty, and I'm an economist and a research fellow in Trinity College Dublin. And I'm going to talk to you about the research component, which I'm doing with Michael King, who's also here in Trinity, and Marcus Goldstein and Julia Vaillant at the Gender Innovation Lab at the World Bank. So I think, Toko has really laid out the context in which they're implementing the graduation program. And given that context, the formative research very early on, as we'll see from the first slide, the research was designed clearly to understand, does the gender of this program really matter for outcomes such as female empowerment, spousal cohesion, intimate partner violence, and ultimately welfare outcomes such as income, consumption. Furthermore, given what they've told you about the design of the Umodzi, the Transforming Gender and Power Relations training, when we add that into programs like the graduation, does it then change these outcomes? So I guess on the next slide, what we'll see is why graduation? Why are we looking at it in this context, in this program? Well, I think it's important to understand there's been an increasing body of research that talks and looks at the graduation and its impacts. And it's found that, well, the graduation does what it says it's going to do. It enables participants to engage in micro-enterprise activities. And in a 6-country study done, they found that the graduation led to an income increase of between 5% to 38%. And in certain countries, this income effect has persisted and in some cases increased after 7 years. And not only does it affect consumption, productive and household assets, but it also affects physical health, political involvement. So in some ways, the graduation is a really promising intervention to tackle extreme poverty. So that's why the focus on graduation. But I think what we'll see in the next slide is that within this context, there's some unknowns, in particularly on gender. So remember I mentioned this 6-country study done initially. They found little or no impact on empowerment indices for women. And even when there was a change initially, this effect didn't persist over time. Though in follow-up research in Bangladesh and Afghanistan, they did find significant impacts on women's empowerment. Other research, though, found that it may have unintended effects, such as decreasing the mobility of women outside the house, or another study found possible takeover by men of the income generating activities over time. And this is important because predominantly, or in a lot of cases, the graduation is targeted to the female spouse. But also if we look at the Malawi context, building on what Toko presented, we collected baseline data before any interventions were rolled out. And what we saw was that of our people we surveyed, 96% of men believe that men should decide priorities for spending money. Over 60% of the men said that they themselves make the final household decision. When we talked to the female spouses in our research sample, over 39% of women said that they can rarely or never spend small amounts of money on their own. Furthermore, 68% of the women said they can rarely or never purchase clothing for themselves or their children from their own earnings without the permission of someone else. when we look at intimate partner violence, but more broadly, 32% of the female spouses said that they experienced at least once emotional, physical, or sexual violence, while 24% had said that they experienced physical or sexual violence from their current partner. So I think this really builds the context of why this research, and yes, as Adele moved to the next slide, we designed the research to look at this context. So in particular, we have two core components. The primary component is a quantitative study that uses randomized control trial methodology to assess what is the impact of the graduation for households that get it compared to those who don't. So what we did was, through the use of a community wealth ranking and a proxy means test, we identified 3,300 households that were poor or very poor. These households were also married and lived together at least 60% of the time. They were distributed equally in the two districts that Concern is working in, Mangochi and Sanje, and they were in 200 villages. So once we had our sample of eligible households and villages, they were randomly allocated either to be a control village or to be in the graduation that was targeted to the female spouses, the graduation that was targeted to the male spouses, or the graduation that was targeted to the female spouses, but where the couples underwent the transforming gender and power relations training. We also split our sample into two cohorts, where the first one started in 2018 and the second started in 2019. So this study is over 5 years. We are just collecting midline data. It'll start later in August. And in the next slide, what we see is that we'll only be able to estimate the welfare and empowerment impacts after this data is collected. But each year we've been collecting data, smaller data. And what we've been able to see is, in terms of the graduation itself, that it is already having positive impact on the household's food security. So in 2019, about 75% of the households were hit by Cyclone Idai, quite extreme flooding. And we found that graduation households in the first cohort that received the graduation were more food secure than all other households. And then last year, we collected a module on COVID and the impacts of COVID in Malawi. And we found that being a graduation household was correlated to being more food secure through the COVID pandemic than control households. Now, in terms of gender impacts, when COVID hit, Concern Malawi adapted that program to provide gender-sensitive messaging to the households that were undergoing the gender transformative and power relations training. In particular, because a lot of the precautions, such as washing hands, had a lot of implications for women's roles and responsibilities, like collecting more water, washing kids' hands, taking care of their welfare as well. So what we found when we collected this COVID information is that providing gender-sensitive messaging on COVID affects beliefs. 32% of households that received both the graduation and the gender training held egalitarian beliefs regarding the division of labor between genders within the household. So 32% were likely to say it is the responsibility of both the male and the female to collect water, to wash children's hands, compared to only 20% of households who said this in the control households. So, and this difference between the two is significant at the 1% level. Now, in addition to this quantitative part, we've also incorporated a very core qualitative component. And it's the component we've incorporated is called the Qualitative Impact Protocol. It was designed in Bath University by Professor James Cobb-Stake. And I think it's really interesting because as a tool, it's designed to help us understand participants' own interpretation of the impact of the program in their lives and what are the drivers behind it, what's causing this change. And the other reason I think this is very interesting is that the qualitative researchers who go and interview the households don't actually know what program or what component they're interviewing the households for. So they're program neutral. But the questions are designed such that if there is impact and the households have experienced that impact and they identify it, then it will come out. So this research is done in partnership with BAC's Social and Development Research Unit and the Center for Social Research at Trinity College in University of Malawi. Now, our QUIP is designed in particular to understand the change seen by women who were targeted by the graduation, so female spouses, and households where the female spouse was targeted by the graduation, but the couples underwent the gender transformative training. So we conducted 48 interviews equally across both districts with 8 focus groups in the 2 districts. Now, what we see from the findings, right, is that regardless, in the next slide, what we'll see is that regardless of the type of graduation program that people received, an increasing proportion of women were able to start businesses, invest in productive assets, and undertake farming. So we have a nice quote here, which I think captures it, is, "This money boosted my income, and I managed to buy goats, chickens, a bicycle, and iron sheets. I now live in a better house, and the livestock provide a steady source of income in times of shock. As a woman, I own blankets and clothes, but have recently acquired livestock and iron sheets due to the cash transfer from Concern Worldwide." So increasing income generating activities. But what we also see in the next slide is that twice as many respondents in households that received the couples training noted positive changes in household expenditure. So many of the respondents who underwent the couples training, in addition to receiving the graduation program, acknowledged the empowerment effect of owning and spending money they earned themselves. And remember the previous number I gave you, where 68% of women said that they can rarely or never spend money they own themselves to purchase their own clothing without permission from someone else. So again, here's a quote from one of the interviews. "Before Tualoke, we were buying food, but now we have also bought iron sheets and livestock since we received some money from the project. Previously, it was my husband who was chiefly responsible for determining how to spend money, but now he involves me because of the training on gender that Tualoke provided us with. I've been able to buy things like livestock, which was not possible before Tualoke came into the picture. I used to just buy food because with the money we were earning, that is all we could manage." We also found that respondents reported perceived changes in intra-household roles and responsibilities. So domestic responsibilities were now more likely to be shared, with men taking an increasing role in some domestic tasks rather than this just being the sole responsibility of women. And the major driver that people attributed this change to was the Transforming Gender and Power Relations training. And remember, this is in the context which Toko earlier said, that it's not seen as okay for men to do these roles. So again, in our next slide, we have a nice quote that captures this. "Before Concern Worldwide trained us on gender, I would do all the household chores alone, and my husband would still shout at me for leaving out some tasks, even with fatigue at play. He was very insensitive, and he would just sit at home and watch me work. If there was no fence to fix, he would just fold his arms at home and not help me at all. Now we share chores, and he even helps me with the children, all thanks to the gender equality training from Concern Worldwide." Now, I want us to hold here for 1 second, right? Because this, it's a very explicit identification of the driver of change here. But we have to remember that when these households were getting interviewed, there was no mention of concern, gender, or equality training. These are changes that households have self-identified, and the drivers are what they've identified that has led to these changes. So I think what's very interesting about the qualitative is that it's able to let us build a theory of change or pathways of change from participants' perspective. So now if we look at the right side of the slide, we have changes that households have identified, such as improved intra-household relationships, positive psychosocial well-being, freeing up of time and labor, and collaboration. Now, if we move left in the middle, we see what households have attributed the drivers, what caused these changes, in particular things like fewer arguments, shared responsibilities, and the emphasis of the importance of shared responsibilities. And finally, we're able to trace back what was the main driver that brought about this change, and households identified concerns, couples training behind this. So through this, we see from the participants' perspective what changes they experienced and why these changes were brought about. Now, I've given a very positive picture, right? But it's very important to also say that we only saw some changes in decision-making on the use and sale of assets or property and on income earned. We found no evidence yet of significant changes in the deep-rooted patriarchal sociocultural norms whereby men are the main decision makers. So on that note, I think I'll move to the final slide in my presentation, which is the relevance of this research. I think this research is important because it will enable both practitioners and policymakers to identify the effect of the graduation model on the lives of the poor, particularly women. We'll also be able to understand when we vary this graduation, how it affects or has no effective change on specific improvements in the lives of the poor, particularly women. And finally, it'll be one of the first studies to examine the gender dynamics of the graduation model. So on that note, I want to thank you for your time and turn it back to Toko.
Thanks, Tara. So we'll now share with you a video so that you can appreciate our program participants and hear the stories from the field.
Ifwa yaje bungwe ya konseni idabwera bwera ndikulembera m'mamidzi muno taphunzira zinthu zoti tikabwera ku nyumba zinthu zimenezo zasintha moyo wathu tikusiyanisa kuti poyamba puja tajati kuphunzira maphunziro a umodzi ayi ife akazi tidali kugwira zintchito mwa ife tokha amuna ade kuyimirira zintchito zezo rayi koma pano taphunzira umodzi amuna kugwirambo ntchito imene tikugwira ifenso akazi tikugwiranso ntchito mothandizana ndi amunathu ntchito zolima kuthandizana zapakhomo abambo kusesambo abambo kuchapambo bambo kutithandizambo mabizinesi kapita ku bizinesi ukabwera upezambo chokudya mbale zatha kutsukidwa nyumba mwatha kusesedwa zovala achapambo umafikirambo kupumambo
sinaone kazi uvuta ifwa kuti naphunzira nkhani ya gender ndikubaza nimati hayi mene ndi gender ndifati nimagwira mosangala mupanda chivuto iliyonse ya kwa hiyo anaona ngati ni zachilendo koma kwa ino kupoza ndinaziphunzira nanenso nimalakalaka kwa maphunzisanso kuti zimakhalira ndi choncho samakhalira zakalekale ya chifukwa kuti amuna amene akukana kugwira ntchito zachikazi amene wali mbokosi zolongola nazija zomenya nazija zinatha ndithu ngati mene ndinaphunzira zimakhala ndithu wansangala chawino
vanonso matha kwathandiza amayi mina kuti amayi wapita kudimba bamboso mina wapita akasaka ndrama moti fili mafika kuchuka mbale kuphika sima akabwera kumene kuchamba peza tusima apya kale mafika kudya nawo zapitiza kugwira ntchito mmene zifole ntchito zimene zabwino kwambiri ndimona ngati ntchito za mabanja zimapepuka ndiponso matukulana mwachangu chimodzimodzi nsizasukanso mbali chimodzimodzi
manje patoniza zithandiza ifwa kuti no tikukwera kapena tikuchoka paja pamene tidali kageta panga zaidi kukoje ya nyumba timakhala nyumba iyo iluko
tindaida kuti mubanja ukonda kugwizana kudalipo mundu akachita pinthu vinatani vinajuwe ndi pakadai pano tikuchita chinthu topanga anthu angasi awiri zanithandiza poyamba ndikapingika ndikabuka kumunda ndikabwera nditunge maji ndichuke mbale ndiphate pa moto nditunge maji akusamba iwo nditunge maji akusamba makolo kena ndikwatepo ndisambise pontho ana akakuti kuli kuchapa nguwa ndikwalano nguwa ndani pontho ndipepo ndikabhizika mani ndipano kangati pabwera umodzi ndola ngati penshevi kusintha kupanika ndikupanika pontho ndikungokhala ngati mene ndikukhalirampo mbale matsuya alimozi maji amata kanithandiza anaona kana bizika mani mwana ina mata kutenga ni kuchapa matrela kapena rai kutenga mwana uja yo machapa matrela kwa kuna chitwa vile pana kupita nimbo nakupichitambo pano chitukuko chikafuna chitimire pano chituko inaenda patsogolo nyumba njina mangu akala yasanzweto monga mbuzi tegula kale zilipo nkhuku tagula kale pano asanga kadikuinikirambo ng'ombe njinga moto monga gali moto tinekhumbira kuti tani nayo kuti khale nayo ndi masomphenya patsogolo anafunifuna ngapita kuti kwaniriso masomphenya athu
modiso pali china chimene chanithandizanso apanga nkhanza kwambiri kummenya nthawi ina kumwatira kumano kazi pano yayi ndi ulipo ngati ana anga kuli chonchonso ndikuti no sadzatengera zimene tinali kuchita pambo ja angati uziwala ndikukumbukira kuti mbanja kapena kuti no anthu akwatirana amakhala chonchi.
So to bring it all together, will talk us through where we can go from here. While we have learned a lot from integrating Umodzi into the graduation approach, there are still some gaps which we identified. The first is community versus and also household interventions for gender empowerment. That is what interventions work at the community level and are needed to change, to promote change at the household level. And even at the household level, like what works best at this level. The second thing is intensity and duration. That is for how long or how often do these interventions need to happen to bring about the needed change. And finally is scalability of such gender transformational programs within graduation. So we'll show one more case study and then I'll come back and wrap up the discussion for today.
Maphunziro umodzi amakhala kuti mamuna ndi mkazi azipanga ntchito imodzi. Maphunziro umodzi amatipangisa kuti ifenso mabanja mwathu mutikhale mabanja opambana chifukwa chochokera maphunziro umodzi.
Business ya gender yo china chilichonse ndikuendera limodzi. Business madam yanipindulira ngati imene afotokozera kuti pano tamanga boys kota komanso taumba njerwa 20 door tagula malata ali nyumbamu china chilichonse takwanirisa ziweto mbuzi ndinazo 15 mabaka ndisindiwerenga nkhuku zosanena ndili mumodzi na budget yapasweni mumodzi kumbala majedo ndikana ku school zovala nakaside kuzikhalira kwene pabanja panopo chakudya mbo ndikuti mamawa masana madzo china chonse chikutani ndikuyenda ndikuona ngati moyo wanga uli pabwino.
Monga ngati kuchapa mbuyo musini mapanga zochapa kuma panopa ni machapa kaya kuwaza nkhuni kumene kale kuchapa mmale ni machapa mbuyo zimene sini mapanga tunaona kweni mwana kuti ya ntchito zimene zazimayi zimene siningapange ni monga mamuna
nkhabe ngamade kukomerwa bwenji poli ndiona ngati nyengo zanga zidasintha anangu ade kuseka ati abusa mbole ngopepera dai mpaka na ntchito zachikazi anangu ade kusiliramo kuti mamuna ngamba ngafika pepale munde kuti zinandiendera ndide kuwaphunyisa kuti mukaona ngati mphe kupupa musolo mwana ine pikunikomera pakuma panga pachinja ndipo akujiwa kuti pachinjaji
sinimabwera pambo chifukwa ndimadziwa chimene ndikuchita ndimene ndikuchitira sinimabwera mbo ndimapita patsogolo kuti wina akaona mwina atengereponso naye.
And finally, would therefore love to learn which community approaches others have used. And also, if you have any experiences which you can share with the group, you can do so in the chat. I will now hand over back to the moderator. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you, concerned team. It was really fantastic, very insightful presentation, a lot of learning and insights. And we have few questions from our audience. While I'll take few questions from there, meanwhile, if any one of you wants to share your experience around gender transformative programming, anything that you may have tried out during pandemic time, do raise your hand. Meanwhile, I'll just bring some of the questions that you have mentioned, and maybe I can begin with for like the questions that were posed for concerned team. There's some few specific questions. So is like, is the Quip tool open access? Do you want to answer?
Yeah, so the Quip is done with the University of Bath. It's not fully open access. They work with it. So I'm not sure, like the analysis and the way they do it is very particular to how they've designed it. But there's a lot of information there and the reports are all open and available.
Wonderful, thank you. There is another very interesting question is that, during pandemic, I think you have shared some of the insights that you learned during the pandemic and how the program actually facilitated or supported families in coping during the pandemic time. Has like any challenges, any specific challenges that you may have experienced during pandemic in terms of program implementation? Would you like to share that?
Yeah, I can start. So one of the most obvious ones was the reduced access or physical contact with the program participants. So we had to either postpone or maybe implement activities at a smaller scale. So this was one of the challenges that we met. But then on the other hand, we did also use this program in order to sensitize people in the rural areas about COVID-19, its effects, how it's transmitted, and we did work closely with the government as well.
Thank you. And there was one more question. Quick question was, if you have done some cost calculation and listening to the whole presentation, it appears that it's quite resource intensive, and in both ways, human resource, and probably linked with that is the financial one. So one is that, have you done some cost calculation? And if it is actually resource intensive process, what are the potential for scaling up, or the challenges that you see in that?
So, like I said, we're the first to roll out this program in Malawi. So initially, we also got pushback from the government saying that it's very expensive, it can't work. But then through sharing our findings, constant engagement with the government, we saw them take up the same approach. So now even the government, which is usually resource constrained, is implementing the same graduation program because they saw that it works. And whatever input or anything that you put in, the returns are much better. And the other thing is we also work with local non-governmental organizations. As you know, Concern Worldwide is an international NGO. So we have been able to train them on how to implement this program, worked closely with them and empower them. And they have also been able to source funding on their own, and they are able to implement such programs on their own. In terms of the exact cost, we have other learning papers which we can share, but because we haven't reached the end of the program, I can't say the exact amount in dollars as opposed to what we benefited. But then we should have these findings at the end of the year.
Thank you.
And in addition, just to point to that, I think, all the initial studies on graduation did quite a bit of cost benefit analysis. And while quite expensive, I guess they're upfront expensive. And in the studies done so far, and there's quite a few on the Poverty Action Org, like there's a few comparing costs, and they found the graduation program actually cost effective in terms of the returns. So it seems expensive, but with the returns and the income increase, it's quite effective and not so costly when you think of the returns from it.
Thanks, Sarah. I think this analysis will be extremely helpful, thinking from scalability point of view, and who can be the potential implementer in terms of scale up. So that can be very interesting. There are some questions for ICRW team, and so there is like one question which is about did the couple face parental pressure to have a second child, particularly son, after the first one, and linked, not necessarily linked that way, but it's closely associated. How do we deal with such toxic masculinities in societies like that of rural Bihar? So do you want to reflect on this?
Well, I can take the first one, but Pranita, please contribute to the answers. So in terms of, I think this question about the pressure on the second child or a son was asked after the first case study. But in general, just to answer that, yes, couples did face a lot of parental pressure, especially in cases where it was a joint family. The pressures were high. But when we look at the three couple types, if they were mutuals, they were able to negotiate with those pressures in a much more collaborative and in a much more successful manner, so to say, than vis-a-vis the functionals and the discordance because their own interpersonal dynamic was affected, and hence their negotiating power with others in the household or the community remained compromised. All like the in the context where the study was conducted, the preference for son and for subsequent births is pretty dominant and high, and different couples dealt with it differently. I hope that answers that.
Thanks, Kuika. On the toxic masculinities, I think that there are a lot of evidence as to what can work around that, but there are this whole discussion is are like most of our work be around family planning, or even if you look at our education system, how responsive those are, or gender responsive or gender equitable those are. So most of our socialization process still promotes aggression, those masculine notion which in a way support and condone uh, aggression, violence. Uh, no, even when there are situations of violence against women, they are being blamed. So one is about one is that collective acceptance that yes, this is a huge problem that we have in our society and that we need to really collectively address it. The next is that then using all the avenues and the opportunities, so be it school, be it the training programs that we do in our health system, any such engagement, we need to really use that opportunity to build perspective. So any training that we are doing with medical professional, we are doing with that whole the cadres that we are building, there is extremely important to bring the whole issue of gender and also together with intersectionality for people to really understand how gender relation operates, power relation operates in that space, and how it really marginalize some people while giving power to other. So first is the building that perspective is extremely crucial, and it's really necessary that all and every training program, the engagement, the space where we engage with young people, older people, we need to really utilize and optimize in building that perspective, making gender transformative approach, or bringing the gender lens non-negotiable in our engagement, and that's equally extremely important within the space of family planning as well. So this whole point about the while the decisions lies with sorry sorry. So while the decision lies with men, the burden of using and bearing the side effects lie with women. So I think that's the first is to recognize and then optimize on all the spaces to address it. Sorry, I took a lot of time. If there are any specific questions.
Thank you, Pranita. And thank you indeed all the speakers for wonderful presentations. My question is that, how do we cultivate more of the collaborative couples? Is it just that, we found them in our sample, or is there something that determines and drives them towards, more collaboration? And in the second part of the program, we did understand that, the gender training and the graduation program was an input. But in the first presentation, we just got a sense of the three types of couples. My question is, how do we cultivate more of the collaborative type?
So, Mr. Do you want to take this up?
Yeah, thanks, Pranita. And thanks, Andy, for the very interesting question. So I think I'll have to go a little bit backward into what the program was about. So at this stage, we didn't actually implement any of the intervention designs, because a lot of that was supposed to be done around the time when COVID struck. So, however, I would say that we did come up with specific strategies aimed at the three kinds of typologies that we spoke about today. So, in terms of the collaborative part of it, like where the element of collaboration is already high, we did come up with a set of strategies that could provide a greater enabling environment for that to be fostered and nurtured further. For example, if in that situation we take one element of the various characteristics that we spoke about, if we take one element that is around aspirations of the couple as well as the two individuals that make the unit, and we understand a little bit more on where the aspirations are being driven from for the man and the woman, as well as the couple, which we have profiled here based on a broad averaging of what we saw in the data. But it can be cultivated further to address specific needs and requirements and aspirations. So, for example, if the couple is open to better skilling opportunities, or they express that they want to achieve a certain kind of a savings pool before having another child, there are various strategies that we were able to outline, looking at the current landscape of programming and also adding some elements from what we learned into actually capitalizing on that aspirations and creating the space for them for better communication, more open transaction in terms of ideas as well as planning linked to their financial aspirations, for example, and also gearing awareness and training and capacity building exercises and information access to enable this communication and decision making to be more gender equitable, since that was one of the core ideas that we were working with. So I can go on for a long time, but I'll stop here. We'll definitely be very happy for you to take a look at our resources. We have shared a link in the chat box. A lot of it is there on our webpage, and also happy to have conversations outside of this space. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We would love to hear from you, because we are implementing a similar project called Male Engagement in a couple of blocks in Bihar, in one of the districts in Bihar. And we are kind of following a lot of what we heard from you and from our colleague from Malawi. We are planning to introduce a financial planning course for newlywed couples and low parity couples, and kind of use that as our window to get into the household for initiating discussions on family planning. We can talk more about it later, but thank you very much for this.
And I could just add that I think it's always important with the kind of couples dialogue approach that we were talking about, that we just start with people who are most willing, because they are the people who are most easy to kind of start making changes in their own lives. And then once you have a small group of people that are willing to do that, they can then influence others in their community to different extents. So in some countries, we would select people from the groups who were really willing and really showing, positive attitudes towards gender equality, and then we would ask them to do more kind of to use different ways to disseminate the kinds of things that they've learned and the changes they've made to other men, for example, in the community, so that we have different kind of adaptations of this approach in different countries. But I suppose the key is you engage the men, particularly the women too, but particularly the men who might see this as not really their concern, especially if your program is targeted at women, and you attract them by kind of talking about coming to sessions, coming to a training that's going to improve your family life and the well-being of your family, which is hard for anyone to kind of disagree with, really. And then once you've got them on board, you can really run with the ones who are already kind of thinking a little bit along those lines, and then use them to kind of gain that traction, and that's how you can start to change some of those social norms for the rest of the community. But then, as Toko said in our presentation, that's something we're also working on in terms of what really works to disseminate those messages, because as far as we know so far, there hasn't been too much real hard evidence on that. So that's something we're also keen to look at going forward.
Great.
Thanks, Adil. Yeah, adding. And I think the one other important point is also about investing in the people, building their perspective, gender perspective, who are supposed to engage with women-men couples. And that's what we also, Andy, we have seen the struggle that ASHAs have or ANMs have, given their own understanding of family planning and who should really take that up. And that really, in a way, limit their engagement with men as well. So that's also important, that have we really invested enough in building perspective of the frontline workers who are supposed to engage with, and also whether we have recognized their own vulnerabilities and challenges. So yeah. So thank you. We have 6 more minutes. Concern team has already discussed about some of the challenges. Would you like to take up this question? What advice would you give to others who want to implement such approach? Any specific suggestion from concern team?
Yeah, I think one of the most critical things that we did to make sure that the program was successful was that we had a pilot stage. So before we started the full program implementation, because we're adopting this approach from other countries and it was the first, we piloted the program. So I would say that piloting it and making sure that the assumptions that you had in the first place are correct should be one of the most critical things that you should do.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't.
There was one other question on whether the other multinational studies that showed significant impact, whether they had control groups. And all the studies I mentioned in graduation, at least the ones on income increases, had control groups. And that was from...
Yeah, that's right. There are a lot of appreciation for the video and for both the presentation. I don't really see any specific. Okay, so there is one question. I think I don't remember if you had already responded. So it's again with the concerned team. In your study context, so I suppose this is about Malawi context, does a man that leaves his family face any social or cultural consequences?
Yeah, this depends, but mostly these matrilineal families, that is where the man leaves his family and goes to the woman's side. One of the things is that the children do not belong to him. So whatever happens, it's like the children belong to the woman's side of the family and not to his side of the family. And the other thing is sometimes because of inheritance issues, it's the woman's brother who's responsible for assets, for example, the house, the children of that particular household. So these two are mostly the main consequences of this matrilineal type of households.
Thank you, Toko, and thank you, everyone, all the presenters. Thank you to all the audience who have stayed throughout the session. Thank you all. I hand over to Lakshman, and over to you, Lakshman, for any last minute point.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. That was amazing session. Thank you for sharing amazing learnings emerging from the field. So, and thank you all for everyone to join today. For more programs, you can visit this web link, menengage.org/symposium. And once you go there, you'll have to click on the menu button called Agenda, and then it'll give you a list of programs and the sessions we have. And if you further click on each of the programs title, it will further expand to, for additional information, as well as speakers, and as well as the link to register. And you will have to register for each of the sessions that you would like to join. If you are continually using the app and the programs, continue your engagement there. You can have the links to the sessions, recordings as well, but the recordings also we are putting outline up in the Menengage YouTube channel. So together, so like this one, we will be putting out in a couple of days in the YouTube channel that you can again come back and look at it. But also any other sessions that you may not have been able to attend will be uploaded or have been uploaded there. So feel free to visit the Menengage channel in the YouTube. Join on the discussion board as well as submit any questions. These are again in Spanish and French as well. So thank you for joining us, and we will continue to having you online, hopefully. And you all stay well and safe, and wherever you are, have the good rest of the day, whether it's evening, good evening, and afternoon and morning for those who are in the morning side of the time zone. So thank you very much. Take care.